Hello everybody and welcome back to this very interesting video where we are going to run over the top 4 highest performing ETFs of 2020. As you can see here from the graph, they have all delivered monstrous returns over the last year. The lowest one is 97.55%, and that is XWEB, which is based on Internet ETF. The next one is WCLN, WisdomTree Cloud Computing ETF, so it focuses on cloud companies. You have the next one on 159.76%, that is the ARKK, ARK Innovation ETF. And finally, with 181.77%, we have QCLN, First Trust NASDAQ Clean Edge Green Energy IDX FD ETF, which we ran over in a separate video earlier this year. So QCLN focus on renewables, clean energy. They invest 90% of its assets in companies that is traded in the US on the small, mid and large capitalization. You then have ARKK, which invest 65% of its assets in both domestic and foreign equity securities of companies that are relevant to the fund's investment theme of disruptive innovation. So similar to the other ETFs from ARK, it's disruptive companies that they focus on. The WisdomTree cloud computing companies invest at least 80% of its assets into these kind of companies. And then you have XWEB here, which invest 80% of its assets in companies within the internet sphere. As you can see, the current share price 70.38 for QCLN, 134.90 for ARKK, 56.50 for WCLD, and 162.15 for XWEB. With the ETFs, one of the things that we are interested in is to understand the liquidity of the ETF, how easy it is to buy and sell it. And one of the ways to look at that is to look at the median bid-ask spread. This is the difference between the highest price buyer is willing to pay and the lowest price that the seller is willing to accept. If you have a high median bid-ask spread rate, it means that it's in general less liquid, while as when it has a low, like 0.10% for QCLN, it means that it's relatively liquid. So if we take a look across, they are all relatively liquid ETFs. You can also see on the average volume here per day, there's being traded quite a lot of the shares in the ETF. So again, no worries with any of them. XWEB is the lowest of all the 4. We can also take a look at the beta ratio, which just shows the volatility in relation to the overall market. And if it's above 1, it means it's more volatile. And as you can see here, QCLN is quite volatile, which is by no surprise given the rise in renewable stocks this year. Similar with ARKK. WCLD is a little bit less, but still more than the general market. And XWEB is also quite volatile. Last, we have the tracking error, which shows the divergence between the price behavior of the ETF and the price behavior of the underlying index. So as you're aware, in an ETF, they're usually trying to track an index of some sort. Again, these are not tracking a very common index like S&P 500. Some of them are focusing on less known or their own developed index that they're trying to follow. So here the tracking error will in general be greater. And as you can see across the board, there is 15 to 20% difference between the index that they're trying to track. That's not always bad. Sometimes they actually deliver better than the index that they're trying to track. Sometimes it is worse. But for an active managed ETF like this one, it is common to see higher tracking error numbers. For us, it is always important to understand the risk profile, and therefore we like to check the country holdings of each ETF. And as you can see in QCLN here, it is heavily focused on the United States, but you also have something in China and in Canada. But it's not very diversified, but it's neither totally non-diversified like some of the others we will see. ARKK is more focused on the US, but they have a bit more different countries in their ETF portfolio. WCLD is very focused on the United States, as you can see here with 96.92%, but it has a little bit in Canada and Israel as well. And finally, you have XWEB, where all your exposure are to companies in the United States. The second part is to look at the company holdings, and here we like to look at the top 10 company holdings. And QCLN, there's a lot of familiar names that we have covered in a lot of other videos like NIO, Enphase, Tesla, Albemarle, SolarEdge, Sunrun, and Plug Power, Brookfield Renewable Partners. So a lot of known names and a lot of good names among them. I think the only one that we didn't really like so far is Sunrun. Plug Power is a bit speculative, but they have been doing really well. The next one, ARKK, again, also has a lot of known companies. Obviously, the biggest position is in Tesla, which has grown amazingly over this year. You also have Square Inc., you have Roku, you have Teladoc, you have Slack Technologies. So quite a lot of known companies as well in the top 10 holdings. WCLD is obviously focused on cloud companies. And here we must admit that there's a lot more companies that we are not too familiar with. We have obviously the Zoom video communication, which has grown a lot during the coronavirus due to people being working from home. You also have Slack Technologies, but actually a lot of the others are not too familiar for us. And finally, you have XWEB, which also has quite a few companies that are known to people. You have Pinterest, you have Snap Inc., you have Yelp, you have Etsy. So again, quite known companies, but we must admit that XWEB, these companies are still less known to us than what you will see in QCLN and the ARKK ETFs. So just to summarize what we have been looking at so far, first we looked at the industry focus, one of them QCLN, renewables, ARK, technology with a focus on disruption. You have WCLD, it's technology and cloud, and you have XWEB, which is technology internet. In terms of risk beta and the track error, for QCLN it's high, for the ARK and WCLD, it's medium, and XWEB is also high for us, but again, they're relatively close to each other. On liquidity, all of them are quite high. There's none of them that we are too concerned about in terms of if we're going to invest in them, you can easily trade them. And finally, the country diversification. QCLN and ARK is more medium. Again, it's not very high diversification, but it's closer to medium than low when you look at the others, WCLD and XWEB, which was heavily focused on the United States. And finally, on the stock diversification part for QCLN and ARK, we feel that it's medium. They have a bit more larger positions in their top 10 company holdings than WCLD and XWEB has, which is a bit more diversified in our opinion. If you are a dividend-oriented investor, you may want to understand how high the dividend yield was for the last year, but as you can see across the board here, very small dividend yield. XWEB is the highest with 0.52%, and WCLD actually didn't pay any dividend. Total expense ratio, another important metric, which is the annual cost that you're going to incur, which in the long run can have a huge impact. And you can see ARK here, although it's only 0.75%, it is twice as much as what XWEB is going to charge you, which is 0.35%. So again, if you have two ETFs with relatively similar returns, this is the ratio that may determine which one is the best in the long term. So we so far looked at the return for 1 year, but we always want to understand how have these ETFs been performing over a longer period. And we just want to note here that there is a slight difference in the returns that you are seeing. This is basically due to that the graph that we see in the initial slide is coming from a different provider. So there is a small difference, but overall they are close to each other, of course. But as you can see here for QCLN, which had a few difficult years in the beginning, but over the last 2 years have grown massively, and we expect that to continue in the future. Similar, ARKK has done really well actually overall. Okay, 5 years ago it had a -3%, and 3 years ago a -8%, but when you see overall the returns that you have gotten over the last 6 years, it's quite impressive, and obviously we hope that that will continue in the future. WCLD, it's very clear here that this is the first year the ETF has been created, and a return on 128% is still quite good, but we do not have any benchmark with the remaining years, so we do not know yet if this is something that is going to be 100% sustainable. We obviously have an idea because they're investing in cloud computing, which we expect also will continue its growth in the future, but there's not any guarantees that this ETF will be performing as well, of course, in the future. And lastly, we have XWEB. It's a quite similar story here. It has only been around for 2 years, but they have been doing quite well here with 15% in the first year and 102% in the second year. So it's going to be very interesting to follow them in the future. Finally, we just want to look at the uptrend part and look at the simple moving averages for 20 days, 50 days, and 200 days. And no surprise here, all companies are in an uptrend, and we expect again that to continue in the future. So back to the overview, we looked at the dividend yield, and again it was nothing really impressive. So if you're a dividend oriented investor, you may not want to invest in these type of ETFs, but XWEB was paying the highest with 0.52%. WCLD was not paying anything. On the expense ratio, XWEB was also the cheapest with around 0.35% per annum, and ARKK was the highest with around 0.75% per year. So again, if the performance are relatively similar, this is an area where it can make a difference in the long run. On the performance for 1 year, we saw the QCLN had been doing the best, followed by ARKK, while as for the 6 years, ARKK has actually been done better than QCLN. Finally, the trend for all the stocks, they're in an uptrend, and at least for some of them, we believe that that will continue in the future. So just to sum up, which is our top picks? What is the verdict on each of these companies? Well, good outlooks for all these ETFs, we believe. If we look at QCLN, good long-term value. We would not be concerned investing in them. As we said in our recent video where we were benchmarking the 4 clean energy ETFs, QCLN was our second pick. The first pick was PBW. It has increased fast, and a pullback can happen. So again, we wouldn't say jump in immediately, but again, if you are looking at a short-term gain, that is what you need to consider. If you're looking for the long-term, again, we wouldn't be concerned investing in this ETF. Similar on ARKK, there's many interesting companies. They have delivered well over the last 6 years. A bit high exposure to Tesla in our opinion. We know a lot of people really like Tesla, and they're a great company, but with the increase that the stock have seen over the last months, we just believe it's a bit too high and it's a bit too speculative. So we're a little bit concerned about that, but again, ARKK seems to be knowing what they're doing in general with a lot of their ETFs, so no huge concerns on our side. Then we have WCLD. It is a good first year that they have had, but there's a lot of unknown companies to us, which makes us a little bit doubtful as we want to jump into them right now. We would probably have to understand a bit more details, the companies, before taking a decision. So again, we're not saying that you shouldn't invest in this ETF. It may be a great buy, but we just don't know it too well. And a little bit similar story with XWEB. There's more known companies to us. They've had 2 good first years. Again, we are not sure whether the companies in the top 10 are that much our taste, like Pinterest and Snap Inc. It's not our favorite stock. So again, we would, in the end of the day, probably prefer something like QCLN or ARKK if we should benchmark that with XWEB. But again, they have delivered good result over the last year, and they may do so in the future as well. This was all we had for today. We really hope you enjoyed these videos of these high-performing ETFs. Please note that we are not professional financial advisors, and this is only done for entertainment purposes. Please subscribe for future content. Give us a like, it really helps with the algorithm. And also, please give us a comment in the comment section. It's always interesting to hear your guys' inputs. This is all we had for today. Besides that, we just want to wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We will probably launch a video in the coming days as well, but now it has at least been said. Besides that, not much more to say than hasta la vista, baby.